Right now, somewhere between Iran and Oman, over 1,000 ships are sitting still in the ocean. They're not broken, they're not lost, they're waiting. Just stopped. Massive oil tankers, each one longer than 3 football fields, carrying hundreds of millions of dollars worth of crude oil, sitting in the water like they've been paused by someone pressing a button. Container ships loaded with goods that factories are waiting for, that stores are waiting for, that ordinary people ordered weeks ago and haven't received yet. Liquid natural gas carriers, the floating vessels that bring heating fuel to homes across Europe and Asia, anchored and idle in the warm waters of the Gulf of Oman. Over 1,000 ships, 20,000 sailors on board them, all waiting. They are waiting because 33 kilometers away, a distance so short that on a clear day you can almost see from one side to the other, a decision is being made that will affect every single person on this planet. Not every person in the Middle East, not every person who drives a car or pays an electricity bill. Every person. The farmer in rural India whose fertilizer prices are climbing. The family in South Korea whose grocery bill has quietly crept up over the past month. The factory worker in Germany whose employer has just announced a 30% energy surcharge. The taxi driver in Dubai whose city has been shaken by drone strikes and whose income has disappeared almost overnight. All of them are connected to this. All of them are waiting. And what they are waiting for is simple to describe and almost impossibly difficult to achieve. They are waiting for 33 kilometers of water to be declared safe. They are waiting for the Strait of Hormuz to reopen. And they are waiting to find out whether a deadline posted by the President of the United States on a social media platform extended twice already, now set for April 6th, 2026 at 8 in the evening Eastern Time, will be met with a deal or with destruction. This is that story, from the beginning. To understand how the world arrived at this moment, you have to start not with the war, not with the missiles, not even with the politics. You have to start with the geography. Pull up a map of the Middle East and look at the Persian Gulf. It's a body of water shaped a little like a teardrop, enclosed on almost every side by land. To the north and east, Iran. To the west, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE. It is, in many ways, the most economically significant body of water on the planet, because beneath and around it lies the largest concentration of recoverable oil reserves anywhere on Earth. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, Iran itself. Together, these countries hold an extraordinary share of the world's proven oil reserves. And for the most part, getting that oil, and the natural gas that comes with it, out to the rest of the world means putting it on a ship. And those ships have only one way out. At the southeastern tip of the Persian Gulf, where Iran sits on one coastline and the Sultanate of Oman sits on the other, the water narrows. It narrows down to 33 kilometers at its tightest point. A gap, a bottleneck, a choke point. This is the Strait of Hormuz. In normal times, and for most of recent history, it has operated in something close to normal times. This strait is one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. 130 ships pass through it every single day. Tankers carrying crude oil to refineries in Asia, Europe, and beyond. LNG carriers transporting liquefied natural gas to the terminals that feed heating systems and power plants from Tokyo to Rotterdam. Container ships loaded with everything from electronics to clothing to food products, moving between the industrial hubs of the Gulf and the global consumer markets that depend on them. Through those 33 kilometers flows 20% of all the oil traded on the planet. 1 in every 5 barrels, 20 million barrels every single day. The oil that keeps Japan's manufacturing sector running. The oil that South Korea processes into petrochemicals that become plastics and medicines. The oil that China, the world's largest importer, uses to fuel the factories and power plants and transport networks of the world's second largest economy. And it's not just oil. 40% of the world's liquefied natural gas passes through this strait. Qatar alone, the tiny peninsula that juts into the Gulf from Saudi Arabia's eastern coast, is one of the world's largest LNG exporters, and almost all of its exports travel through Hormuz. When Europe scrambled to replace Russian gas supplies after 2022, Qatar became a critical alternative. That alternative depends entirely on this strait staying open. For decades, the world built its energy system on the assumption that it would. The assumption was so deep, so embedded, so taken for granted, that most people who work in energy markets, in shipping, in industrial manufacturing, most of them, if you asked them 5 years ago what their single greatest systemic risk was, would have mentioned Hormuz, and then would have said, but it will never actually close. The consequences would be too severe. No one would actually do it. They were not wrong about the consequences. They were wrong about the never. To understand what changed and why, you have to understand what was happening in the weeks before February 28, 2026. For years, the central tension in Middle Eastern geopolitics had been Iran's nuclear program. Iran had been enriching uranium, the process that, taken far enough, produces the material needed for a nuclear weapon. The United States, Israel, and most of the Western world had been trying, through a combination of sanctions, diplomacy, and periodic threats, to stop that enrichment program or at least constrain it. There had been a deal once, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, signed in 2015, under which Iran agreed to limits on its nuclear activity in exchange for sanctions relief. The United States withdrew from that deal in 2018. Iran gradually walked back its commitments in response. By the mid-2020s, Iran's uranium enrichment was at levels that international monitors described as deeply concerning, and the diplomatic situation had been tense for years. But by early 2026, something significant was happening. Talks had resumed. Oman, the small sultanate at the mouth of the Persian Gulf that has a long tradition of quiet diplomatic mediation, had been hosting negotiations between Iranian and American representatives. Those talks, by all accounts of the people involved in them, were going better than anyone had expected. On February 27, 2026, the Omani foreign minister gave a press conference. He said a breakthrough had been reached. Iran had agreed, in principle, to never stockpile enriched uranium beyond civilian energy needs. Full verification by the International Atomic Energy Agency had been accepted. A second round of talks, the round that would translate these principles into a formal agreement, was scheduled for March 2nd in Geneva. He said peace was within reach. Those words were broadcast around the world. Markets moved. Diplomats exhaled. People who had been watching this situation for years allowed themselves, cautiously, to feel something like hope. 15 hours later, the bombs fell. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military operation against Iran. Operation Epic Fury, they called it. Airstrikes hit military facilities across the country. Radar installations, missile depots, air defense systems, command structures. Nuclear sites were targeted. And in the strikes, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who had ruled the country for 35 years, was killed. It was the first time a sitting head of state had been killed by a foreign military operation since the Second World War. The Omani foreign minister, who had spent months building those negotiations, who had stood before cameras the previous day and announced that peace was within reach, said afterward that he was dismayed. That active and serious diplomacy had been undermined. The Iranian negotiators who had been preparing to fly to Geneva for the second round of talks were instead sheltering from strikes on Tehran. There was no March 2nd. Iran's response came fast and wide. Missiles and drones launched toward U.S. military installations across the region, in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, Iraq, and Jordan. Israeli cities came under sustained fire. The attacks were broad, deliberate, and designed not just to cause military damage, but to send a message to every country in the region that had allowed American forces to operate from its soil. You are not safe from this either. Dubai, one of the most visited cities on Earth, a place that had spent decades building itself as a symbol of stability and prosperity in an unstable region, was struck. Hotels burned. Dubai International Airport, one of the world's busiest, was damaged and temporarily closed. The tourists and expatriates and business travelers who had been in the city found themselves stranded in a place that suddenly looked nothing like the gleaming, peaceful hub they had arrived in. And the Strait of Hormuz was closed. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that no vessel heading to or from the ports of the United States, Israel, or their allies would be permitted to transit. Ships that tried to pass without Iranian clearance were turned away. Some were targeted directly. Over 20 merchant vessels were struck in the first weeks of the conflict. A Thai-flagged cargo ship was attacked, abandoned by its crew, and eventually ran aground on an Iranian island. A Kuwaiti oil tanker, fully loaded, was hit by a drone strike while anchored at the port of Dubai, setting off fears of a catastrophic oil spill in one of the Gulf's busiest harbors. 130 ships a day became fewer than 6. The largest oil supply disruption in the history of the global energy market had begun. The numbers that followed were staggering, and they arrived quickly. Oil, which had been trading at around $75 per barrel in the days before the strikes, began moving immediately. Within the first week, it crossed $100, a level it hadn't reached since 2022. At its peak, Brent crude hit $126 per barrel. Now, those numbers can seem abstract, so let's translate them. Every dollar of sustained increase in the global oil price adds approximately 2 to 3 cents per liter to the cost of fuel at the pump. At $126 per barrel compared to $75 before the war, that's a difference of over $50 per barrel. That translates to somewhere between $1 and $1.50 per liter added to fuel costs. In every country, for every driver, for every business that moves goods by road or air or sea. But fuel costs are only the most visible part of this. Oil is not just what goes into your car's tank. It is the raw material for plastics, the packaging on almost everything you buy. It is the feedstock for fertilizers, the nitrogen compounds that modern industrial farming uses to grow the food that 8 billion people eat. Without affordable fertilizer, food production falls, food prices rise. In countries that are already food insecure, that is not an economic problem. It is a humanitarian one. Oil is embedded in the cost of shipping. And when shipping costs rise, the prices of everything that travels on ships rises with it. Oil is embedded in the cost of electricity generation, in the cost of manufacturing, in the cost of construction, in the cost of medicine production and distribution. When the price of oil rises significantly and stays there, the price of almost everything else eventually follows. Not immediately, not all at once, but steadily, persistently, in ways that are felt most severely by the people who can least afford it. The International Energy Agency, the body created after the 1973 oil crisis specifically to manage situations like this, responded to the Hormuz closure with the largest emergency release of strategic oil reserves in its history. 400 million barrels from the strategic stockpiles of member countries released to cushion the blow to global markets. 400 million barrels sounds like a lot, and it is. It bought time. It prevented the worst of the supply shock from arriving at the pump and the supermarket all at once. But it is not a solution. It is a bridge. The world's strategic reserves exist for emergencies, and they are being used for exactly that. But they are finite, and the strait, as of this recording, is still effectively closed. Meanwhile, on the seabed of the Strait of Hormuz, there is another problem that doesn't show up in oil price charts but may end up mattering more than any of the diplomacy. Before he was killed in an Israeli airstrike in late March, Iran's naval commander, Commodore Alireza Tangsiri, had ordered the placement of sea mines in the strait, underwater explosive devices, anchored to the seabed, designed to detonate on contact with or proximity to a ship's hull. U.S. officials confirmed the presence of at least a dozen of these mines, possibly more. Their exact positions are not fully known. The mine-laying infrastructure has been largely destroyed, but the mines already placed remain where they are, resting on the floor of the world's most important shipping lane. Removing sea mines is one of the most painstaking and dangerous operations in naval warfare. It requires specialized vessels, trained divers, remotely operated underwater vehicles, and time. A lot of time. Even after a political agreement is reached, even after both sides shake hands and announce a ceasefire, the physical work of making the strait safe for large commercial vessels to transit will take weeks at minimum. This is the detail that most coverage of the diplomatic situation glosses over. The strait cannot simply be switched back on like a light. Even in the best-case scenario, the reopening will be gradual, incomplete, and uncertain. Ships will wait, insurers will hedge, captains will be cautious, and the world's energy supply chain will feel the effects long after the political headlines have moved on. Into all of this, the United States launched a formal military campaign on March 19th to reopen the waterway. Naval assets were deployed. Airstrikes targeted Iranian military installations in and around the Gulf. The mine-laying infrastructure was hit, but the mines themselves remain. And the principle of the closure, Iran's assertion that it has the legal and practical right to control passage through this waterway, is not something you can destroy with a missile. That assertion is now being formalized. Iran's parliament, in the week since the war began, has been working on legislation that would enshrine Iranian control over the strait, including the right to charge transit fees for vessels it designates as neutral. What began as a wartime tactic is being converted into a permanent geopolitical position. The implications of that, if it stands, are enormous. The entire structure of international maritime law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which guarantees the right of innocent passage through international straits, would be challenged in the most consequential way imaginable. Every cargo ship, every tanker, every LNG carrier transiting this route would be subject to Iranian approval. The country that controls the strait would, in effect, hold a permanent veto over a fifth of the world's oil supply. That is not a temporary wartime emergency, that is a fundamental restructuring of the global energy order. Which brings us to the deadline.